Today we're going to talk about the analysis of competitive markets. Topics we'll cover in this unit include evaluating the gains and losses from government policies, the efficiency of a competitive market, minimum prices, and the impact of a tax or subsidy. When a government intervenes in a market, some people are going to be made better off. For example, if it controls the price of a good, some people may be able to buy the good at a lower price. But what is the effect on society as a whole? Is total welfare higher or lower when the government intervenes, and by how much? One way to measure the gains and losses from government's policies is needed. Consumer surplus is the total benefit or value that consumers receive beyond what they pay for the good. For example, assume that the market price for a good is $5. Some consumers would be willing to pay more than $5 for the good. I mean, this stands to reason. There are probably many situations where you've wanted to buy something, the price is a certain level, and you'd probably say to yourself, well, that's a good price for it, but I would be willing to pay more. So if you were willing to pay, for example, $9 for the good, and you pay $5, you actually gain some consumer surplus. You, in fact, gain $4 in consumer surplus. The market demand curve shows the willingness to pay for all consumers in the market. Consumer surplus can be measured by the area between the market demand curve and the market price. Consumer surplus measures the total net benefit to consumers. Okay, so we have a measure called consumer surplus, which is going to measure how well off consumers are made when a certain price is offered for a good in the market. Now let's turn our attention to producers. We have a similar measure for producers. And just as with consumer surplus, we've discussed producer surplus previously. Producer surplus is the total benefit or revenue that producers receive beyond what it costs to produce the good. Some producers who produce at the market price would still produce if the price were lower. A producer might be willing to accept $3 for the good, but gets the $5 market price, and here the producer gains a surplus of $2. So you see, just as with consumers who might be willing to pay more for the good than the market price, there are producers who might be willing to still produce the good, even if the price were lower than the market price, and so they get that additional benefit. The firm's supply curve, which is given by the marginal cost curve, as you'll recall, shows the amount that a producer is willing to take for a certain amount of the good. Taken across all firms, producer surplus can be measured by the area between the market supply curve and the market price. Producer surplus measures the total net benefit to producers. So let's take a look at a graph. Okay, we have price on the vertical axis, quantity on the horizontal axis, and here's the market supply curve and a market demand curve. And we have a market clearing price and quantity shown here. Quantity is Q0. And the area above that price line and below the demand curve, which you now see as a yellow triangle, shows the consumer surplus. Okay, so for any price, so anyway, the market price is given by this line here. But what this demand curve shows is that there are consumers in the market who would be willing to pay more than that market price. In fact, there are some consumers who would be willing to pay as much as this, some are willing to pay this. And if you sum all of those consumers together and the surplus that each one of them gets, you get this triangle. And the area of the triangle, therefore, is the consumer surplus. Now, underneath the price line, between the price line and the supply curve, is another triangle, purple triangle, which shows the producer surplus. And that is the gain of all of the producers in the market who get to obtain a price of $5 when they would still be willing to produce for a lower price than that. Okay, because as you'll recall, the supply curve, which is the horizontal sum of all of the firm's marginal cost curves, gives the price at which each firm would be willing to produce. And so you can see that there are some firms, some producers, who would be willing to produce at a much lower price than $5, some slightly higher, and if you aggregate over all of them, you get the area of this triangle as the total producer surplus in the market. Now, to determine the welfare effect of a government policy, we can measure the gain or loss in the total of consumer and producer surplus. In fact, welfare effects are defined as gains and losses to producers and consumers, taking producers and consumers together. Okay, so we're going to measure the welfare effect of government policies on consumers and on producers, and we're going to aggregate those two together to get the total welfare effect, the total benefits or losses to a society from a government policy. Now, to see how we can use our new measure of welfare, let's consider the example of the government instituting a price ceiling. A price ceiling is when the price of a good can't go above a certain price. So the government says there's a price that we're going to set that's going to be the maximum price that firms can charge for this good. So that's an intervention in the market, and we'd like to understand what the welfare effect is of that intervention. Now, with the binding price ceiling, producers and consumers are both going to be affected. How much they are affected can be determined by measuring the changes in consumer and producer surplus. So let's take a look. Here we have our usual pricing quantity and the demand and supply curve for the market. Let's say that the market price in an unregulated market would be P0, and the market quantity would be a resulting Q0. Now, if there is a price ceiling, that would be shown on the chart by a lower price, P max. Let's say the government says you can't charge a higher price than P max if you want to sell in this market. So we remember what the analysis shows here. There's going to be a shortage at that price. The demand at that price will be Q2. The supply will be Q1, and there will be a shortage of Q2 minus Q1. Okay, so what is the effect on welfare? Let's draw a few triangles and rectangles here. Now, you'll remember that if we just allow the price in the market to be the market price of P0, then consumer surplus is going to be this triangle above the price line, and producer surplus will be this triangle below the price line. Now, because we have a price ceiling, the price is going to be limited to be P max. And the quantity that actually gets traded in the market is only going to be Q1, because that's all that suppliers are willing to supply. So the consumer surplus at this price and quantity will be the area above the price line and below the demand curve, which is this trapezoid that I'm outlining right now. Now, the difference between the size of this trapezoid and the triangle, which would have given us the consumer surplus had we not had the government intervene in the market, is that consumers lose this triangle B, and they gain this rectangle area A. Okay, so consumers that can buy the good are going to gain A. Consumers that can't buy are going to gain B. Now, are going to lose B, rather. So so just intuitively, what are we talking about here? Well, remember that if the government doesn't intervene in the market, Q0 units of the good are going to be exchanged. Because the government sets a price ceiling, there's a smaller amount of quantity available in the market, Q1, okay, because firms only want to produce that much. So what happens is some consumers had previously been able to get the good, now they can't get it. The loss that those consumers experience from not being able to get the good that they would otherwise have been able to get is given by this lost consumer surplus triangle B. Okay? Meanwhile, there are some consumers who would have been able to buy the good had the government not intervened and can still get the good at the new lower price, and those are the consumers that go are represented by this quantity Q1. So those consumers would have had a consumer surplus given by this area above the price line. Now their consumer surplus is increased by this rectangle A. Okay, so again, we have a net gain of A minus B to consumers. Now what happens to the producer surplus? Well, producer surplus would have been this triangle under the price line, P0. Now that the price is only P max, it's going to be the triangle under that price line, a much smaller triangle. So the areas that producers lose are the rectangle A plus the triangle C. So overall, if you add this up, you're going to get A and C lost to producers, A gets added to what the consumers get, and B is lost from what the consumers get. So if you drew a little addition equation, you would see that triangles B and C are the net losses to society. Okay, A is transferred from producers to consumers. We call those triangles the deadweight loss of this government policy. Okay, so what we see is this government policy actually makes people unambiguously worse off. Now, the situation, whether there's going to be even a benefit for consumers, will depend upon the elasticity of demand. And so let's take a look at a picture where demand is very inelastic, supply is relatively elastic, and consider the effect of a price ceiling here. Well, consumer surplus is going to be this really large triangle if the government doesn't intervene in the market. If the government does intervene, it's going to be reduced to a trapezoid with this area. So consumers will lose a triangle B and gain a rectangle A. So within elastic demand, this triangle B can be quite large. In fact, it could be larger than A, so that it could be that, not even counting the effect on producers, the effect of a price ceiling could actually be detrimental for consumers. Consumers could actually be made worse off. Now, of course, firms will be made worse off as well. They're going to lose an amount equal to A plus C. But even the consumers themselves could be made worse off. So just to summarize, the change in consumer surplus from price ceiling, when the price is held too low, the quantity demanded increases and the quantity supplied decreases, and we have a shortage. In this situation, some consumers are worse off because they can no longer buy the good. And this decreases the consumer surplus by triangle B that we saw in the previous chart. Meanwhile, some consumers are made better off because they can buy the good, they can still buy the good, and they can buy it at a lower price. And this increases consumer surplus by region A, which is a rectangle. So consumers gain region A, they lose region B. Meanwhile, the effect on producer surplus is that producers sell less and they sell it at a lower price. So this causes producers to lose triangle A, or I'm sorry, actually that's a rectangle A. And then some producers are no longer in the market, and so they lose triangle C. Both of these producer groups lose producer surplus, so producers lose an area equal to A plus C. The overall result is a deadweight loss to society of region B plus region C. And so as we saw, the economy as a whole is worse off since the surplus that used to belong to producers and consumers is gone. And let's just review the picture one more time with demand and supply curves as shown, an equilibrium price of P0, quantity of Q0 if the government doesn't intervene. If the government sets a price ceiling, we instead have a quantity Q1, which will be traded because producers do not want to sell the amount that consumers would like to buy at this price. And as a result of that, we have a loss of consumer surplus of area B, a gain of area A. Producers lose both area A and area C. So area A is transferred from producers to consumers, B is lost to consumers, C is lost to producers, and the overall effect is a deadweight loss of the area B plus C. So again, the total loss is equal to the area B plus C. This deadweight loss measures the inefficiency of the price controls. That's the total loss in surplus, consumer plus producer. And so I'll emphasize here that we're looking at the inefficiency of government intervention in this case. So and whenever the government intervenes in the market, there's going to be this source of inefficiency. Now, that doesn't mean that government intervention is always a bad thing. It's just that we need sometimes to recognize that there's a trade-off between what we might want to gain from government intervention and the inefficiency that it creates. And as we saw also, if demand is sufficiently inelastic, the losses to consumers may be fairly large, and this can have effects in political decisions.